All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. We are about to get started. For our folks on our virtual stream, just wanted to let you know we do have some folks in the room with us today. So if you notice a conversation happening kind of in person, that's what's going on. Um, my name is Shaylin. I'm with Connecticut Landmarks. If you have any issues or any questions, please feel free to use the chat. You can chat with the Connecticut Landmarks or Hempsted Houses accounts, and I'll be able to respond directly. And I will also take any questions that you have and broadcast them here in the room. So thank you for being with us. And we're going to go ahead and I think hand it over.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for being with us. Those out in Zoom land, social media, thank y'all so very much for being with us. I am Tammy Denease, and I am with my friend and co-host today, Joe McGill. Joe's virtual, so you'll be able to see Joe on virtual land, whereas I will have to just hear his voice. But we are here today at the Hempsted Houses in New London, Connecticut, to talk about the history of Juneteenth and slavery in the North. Now, a lot of people were not aware that slavery existed here in the North. They thought slavery was the North was the great hero and that it abolished slavery. But in reality, the North was just as complicit with slavery, especially here in Connecticut. A lot of people grew up here in Connecticut not realizing that Connecticut was a slave state. And Connecticut was actually the last state on paper, to get rid of enslavement in 1848 out of all of the enslaved states. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about why Juneteenth is so important. Now, Juneteenth has only been a national holiday for a short period of time, whereas within the Black community, for some of us, it has been a part of us for a very long time. I'm originally from Columbus, Mississippi, and I grew up knowing about Juneteenth and knowing what Freedom Day was. Now, Freedom Day occurred at different days and different months for the different states and localities because of how long it took the soldiers to make their way to the different towns to let them know that slavery had ended. And so it ended in 1863. However, it would be 2 years, June 19, 1865, that those enslaved in Galveston, Texas, would learn that they were free. Now, was that done by design, or do you think because of the lack of communication back then that it was accidental, that these people had to work extra 2 years without payment? Because up until slavery ended in 1863, these people were getting free labor. The United States government said you can no longer do that. You have to pay for their labor. And so they didn't want to do that. And it would have put them in an economic bind, whereas those who were finally free, they were still being cheated out of their living wages. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about Juneteenth and what it really means and why it came about. So I'm going to turn it over to my friend Joe, and Joe, say a few words for us.
Hello, folks. My name is Joseph McGill, and usually I'm right by the side of my colleague, Tammy Denease, in the Hempsted Houses with you. Thank you for all that showed up and are part of the audience today. And a very special thank you for the network of people who are listening digitally. This is great. I'm getting great ideas for things that we could do together in the future, Tammy, digitally. So yes, Juneteenth is very important. That's one of the reasons I'm not there in the room right now physically with you, is that tomorrow night I will be participating in a campfire conversation and sleepover at Mitchellville, and that is on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. That is they will be celebrating their Juneteenth starting with that event, and it will go on throughout the weekend, just as this one is kicking off right now and will go on throughout the weekend. I will be with you guys physically on Friday for the conversation that we'll have. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, and the events that will go on Saturday. So for those of you in the audience now, and for those of you who are signed in digitally, I hope to meet all of you. But also, because this is Juneteenth season, I call it a season because it is that. Next week, I'll be in Detroit doing an event there. And the actual date of Juneteenth, I will be in Virginia, Botetourt County, celebrating a Juneteenth event. And I'm sure Tammy will talk more about what she'll be doing on the actual date of Juneteenth. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you again, Joe. All right, everyone. So we'll just talk about Juneteenth. We'll talk about enslavement, and we'll talk about slavery here in Connecticut. In 1784, there were approximately 5,234 enslaved individuals in Connecticut. A lot of people didn't realize that until we started having people like myself doing the research and wanting to bring it to the fore, because we no longer wanted to have history be told from a one-sided lens. And so as historians, we tell accurate and complete history, which means we tell everybody's history, and we do not do it with a slant. We do it with facts. And the one thing you cannot do is argue with facts. If it happened, it happened, regardless of the motivation, regardless of why. If it happened, it happened. And unfortunately, there are those who do not want to hear this issue or want this issue to be uncovered. And in reality, thinking like that only hurts everyone, not just a certain group of people. Now, when enslavement was happening here in Connecticut, it was relying on enslaved individuals and slave labor from the West Indies as well as from the South. Here in Connecticut, we have a lot of factories and old factory buildings that are no longer in operation, but they were in operation because they were using the cotton that was being supplied from the South. So you see, the North needed the enslavement labor just as much as the South did. However, the North wants to cover that up and not want to own its part in it, the complicity of it. There were those who benefited that you may not even think benefited from enslavement, such as newspapers. They would put ads in the paper for freedom seekers. Most history likes to say runaway. We like to give them their honor and show them that we call them freedom seekers because they wanted to have the same freedom and rights that others did. So the newspapers would make money because the enslaver would pay them to run ads looking for the freedom seekers. Then you have the insurance companies. Insurance companies made millions of dollars off of enslavers because they would insure their property if they did decide to become freedom seekers. Then you have just everyday life. You have people who were not enslavers. They also benefited from slave labor because they would barter. If their neighbor had something that they wanted, but they couldn't afford to pay for it, but they had an enslaved person, they would rent that enslaved person out to do that work. So you see, slavery involved everything and everyone, but it was to the detriment of a group of people. And it was mainly those who were imported, who were snatched from their homelands and from all that they were familiar with and brought to a place like this to work for free. Now, sometimes when Joe and I travel around, we have different audiences. And sometimes people ask us questions such as, well, were there benevolent slave owners? Were there good slave owners? And they ask that question because it's a sense of, well, it couldn't have been all bad. But what we like to do is ask the question, well, how would you feel if someone had your freedom in their hands, and they told you where to go, when to go, and how to do it? And you were not given payment for the work that you did. So there were no such things as a benevolent slave holder. There was no such thing, did not exist. Oftentimes, the division between the North and the South is in certain treatments, but it was all the same. For instance, in the South, an enslaved person was not allowed to learn how to read and write. It was against the law. They actually had this saying, if you wanted to hide something from a Black person, put it in a book, because they were not allowed to read or write. However, we're going to speak to the resilience of that because they would still learn to read and write, whether it was accepted by the enslaver or not. So there's stories and narratives of those who would listen outside the windows. There would be those who would be under the house that would hear all of the conversations going on. So they were educated. They may not have had the reading and writing skills that the enslaver did, but they were a very resilient people. And so we want to talk about it from the lens of resiliency and not from trauma. Now, in the North, reading and writing was a little bit more accessible to the enslaved because they were expected to know certain things. On Sundays, they were expected to go to church and they were expected to participate. They would learn how to read the Bible. However, they did not have the same Bible that their enslaver had. There's a thing called the slave Bible or the Black Bible in the South is called the Black Bible. And what that means is they would use religion. So again, no one is excused from the benefit of slavery. They would use religion as a way to make the enslaved think that the Creator designed them to be enslaved. And what they would do is remove certain books from the Bible to make it look like that's how it's supposed to be. Again, that was not the case at all. Now, oftentimes during the week, they worked 6 days a week. The Sabbath, they would have off. They would basically have about 6 hours on the Sabbath to themselves. They would have to go to church for a couple of hours and then 6 hours for the rest of that day. That was their time. And that is when they would spend time with family and they would try to rest. Joe, you want to step in real quick?
Yes. Yeah, I wanna stress something that you said, or well, you said quite a bit that I want to touch on, but I'll try to be brief as possible. Now it's 2026, and we are commemorating the 250th anniversary of our freedom from England. And in this freedom, we tend to sometimes forget about the participation of northern states in this institution of slavery, because the northern states are known more for the revolution, the colonial era of our of our time. So we do stress that even after the revolution, northern states were still complicit because that's where the insurance companies were putting insurance on enslaved people. That's where the factories were adding value to the cotton. So we certainly want to commemorate all that. But the Juneteenth part of all that we do is certainly necessary to continue to do what we do because of the threat that's always been to this history that we interpret. But the threat now is more clear and present. And because it's more clear and present, we must build on this that we have established here at the Hempsted Houses. Because I've been coming there for consecutive years since 2012, 2013, 2014. Whenever I started, I've been coming there, and we've been building on what we have, and we will certainly continue to do that. Now, a question that I get asked, was slavery easier in the North or the South? Or was it harshest in the South, or was it harshest in the North? Well, I put them on an equal plane, as Tammy alluded to. Freedom seekers sought freedom whenever it was feasible to them. And being educated, of course, if we look at the revolts that happened, if you look at Nat Turner and his revolt, he was certainly a part of being educated. If you look at Denmark Vesey, I'm in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina. That was a revolt here. That gentleman had knowledge. So we also want to keep all of that in account as we continue to celebrate Juneteenth. So I'll put a period right there, Tammy.
Right. Now, as I was saying about the enslavement in the North versus the South, as Joe said, they're both complicit. They're on the same level. One was not better than the other, except the North throughout history has been able to cover over what they have done. Now, legislation had to get involved to get it corrected. In 1784, there was a law that said that if you were born and made it to 25 or 25 and younger at the time the law was made, you were entitled to your freedom. But then a year later, they changed that to 21. So if you were born at that time or you were 21 and under, you were going to be getting your freedom once you aged to 21. However, there were those who did not get to benefit from those said laws. And one such person was Miss Nancy Toney. She was the last enslaved person in Connecticut to receive her freedom. And she gets it when freedom ends in 1848. And then she passes away in 1858. So she had 10 years of freedom of her life. And she was enslaved by the Loomis Chaffee family, who were very wealthy and a well-known family in the northeast part of the state, in Manchester, Windsor area, in the Windsor area. Now, as legislation was a part of this, we see that laws were needed to govern how individuals would be treated. And so as time is going on, people are fighting for their rights. You have pamphleteers, people who are writing about this information, trying to get it out there to help people. You have such pamphleteers as Phyllis Wheatley. Pamphleteers are people who wrote during that time period, and it was published so that the information can get out in the pamphlets, so that people can understand the harshness of enslavement. So Phyllis Wheatley was one, Prince Hall was one. These were individuals who wrote about the conditions and the treatment, that the inhumane treatment that was being received, that was given to those who were enslaved. But they also talked about the resiliency and the determination of the individuals who were in an oppressed situation to not stay in that situation. And so as we continue to talk about Juneteenth and the celebrations, it's great that it's a national holiday now and people all over the country are starting to learn more about it. But our goal is to make sure it is honored and respected, especially for those who were in those situations. We don't want it to become the next great mattress sale. We don't want it to become the next whatever sale there is for you to come in and spend money. We want people to really pay attention and understand what it means. Now, growing up in Mississippi, like I said, I always knew about Juneteenth. My mom told me about it. Now, in Columbus, Mississippi, it was called the Great Surrender. That was the actual term. In Columbus, Mississippi, the Great Surrender happened May 3rd, 1865. And like I said, it happened on different days because as the troops made their way through the South to let people know each day would be different because they traveled through horseback. So it finally makes its way to Galveston, Texas, and where the enslaved people, after 2 years of still working and being treated as enslaved people, they finally get their freedom because it was done when the Union Army came in to enforce the law. Up until then, those enslavers were not going to tell them, was not going to let them know that if you continue in this condition, we have to pay you, that you can no longer work for free. So when the message was pinned to the door and the Reverend read the note, it let them know that they were all free and that they were no longer expected to work under those conditions or to work for free. Now, some people left some people stayed. Now, why do you think some people stayed, you said? You were like, I finally got my freedom. Why am I staying? Some of them were older and they weren't able to travel. Some of them did not know where to go because, again, remember, they had been in this institution that told them where to go, when to go, and how to go. And so now suddenly freedom is there. Just because freedom is there does not mean that they were free. Freedom was not free because now they have to take care of all of their needs. They have to find shelter. They have to pay for their necessities. All of the things that were somewhat provided, now they have to do it themselves. And so that is what we celebrate, the resiliency. So all they needed was their freedom and the resources. And once they got their freedom and they were able to get some of those resources, they were able to go from surviving to thriving. And that's what we inherited from our ancestors, not just the trauma of enslavement. We inherited that get up and go. We inherited that resilience, that determination, and that need to do what we need to do. And we found a way to do it. Joe?
Oh, yes, we certainly found a way to do it. Now, unfortunately for me, Juneteenth, the knowledge of Juneteenth came later in my life. My formative years, high school, all through K through 12, I did, 6 years in the military. I went to college for 4 years after that. But my knowledge of Juneteenth came about after I became a Civil War reenactor. We kept getting these requests to participate in this thing called Juneteenth. So of course, I had to become familiar with Juneteenth. Therefore, I did my research and found out that it had been a thing, as Tammy mentioned. It depended on the circles that you ran in as to your knowledge of this particular commemoration or celebration. Again, unfortunately, for me, it came later on in life. But when it came on strong because I'm a Civil War reenactor, and I'd be getting these requests to come and participate. Now that it is an official holiday, the month of June has become the busiest month for me. I will do the most traveling this month, much more so than I'll be doing for the rest of the year. Also, as Tammy also alluded to, we want to make sure that we commemorate. That's very important in every gathering that we have for Juneteenth. And I don't mind the cookout, the grilling. I mean, that's good. And they're incorporating fireworks and all that. I'm okay with that. But that lesson must be there, because if that lesson is not there, we're going to have people declaring that no longer can we visit national parks for free on MLK Day and Juneteenth. So we have to be here to be the voice of all those people to make sure that this legacy is carried forward. And I think that we're doing our part, and you guys are doing your part because you're there physically and all the kids are signed in. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for that. And it's true. We want to make sure that as we're commemorating our history, that we remember to put the honor and the dignity on it, because history has taught that we were happy being enslaved, that the enslaver was good to us. And that's called the colonized mind. And colonized minds still exist in various forms today. But as we learn our history, as the truths are being uncovered and being shared, we start to decolonize our mind, meaning we start to know the truth and we start to act and walk accordingly. The systems that are in place, that were put in place back then, no one is responsible for them today. So there's no shame in blaming or guilting, but there's no shame in blaming or guilting of being descendants of those who endured those systems. And so knowing what those systems are is how we are able to continue to commemorate Juneteenth, but also knowing those systems help us in our everyday life. It helps us to understand why things are set up the way they are and how we can survive those, not only survive them, but also thrive in them. A lot of times as an educator and a living historian, when I meet Black people in particular, Black and brown people, a lot of times they don't want to talk about the history because it's too painful. And it's because it has always been taught from a trauma-based lens. But as living historians and individuals who take you back in time through our performances and through things like this, we're helping you to understand that there's no reason to feel like you have to be in an oppressed state when learning about your history and your heritage. I knew my great-grandmother, as some of you know. She was the last direct enslaved person in our family. She lived to be 5 years. My grandmother lived to be 107, and she passed away in 2004. So I spent a lot of time with these women, and I love to tell her story because when she received her freedom on the day of surrender, the person who enslaved her, his name was Johnson, his son did not care for enslavement, and he always wanted them to be free. So at that time, reparations was 40 acres and a mule. And she told him no. that she did not want it, because in order for her to truly have it, he wanted to give it to her. She told him no, because for her to truly have it, she had to pay for it, because she understood the systems that were around her, that if he gave it to her, that some white person with their privilege could just come along and take it. So she told him he had to sell it to her. He agreed, and he sold it to her for $2 an acre. It took her 2 years to pay for those 40 acres at $80. And after those 2 years, everything was hers. And to this day, that land is still in our family. So, and there are other stories like at Jamestown, South Carolina. That is a family-owned organization that has so many acres. I can't remember the acreage, but it's a huge thing. It's been in their family for 150 years. So we're out here, and but the thing of it is, it has been covered over and it has been hidden. So we are pulling the rug back, and we are exposing the true history. And it is nothing to be ashamed of. It is a conversation that needs to be had so that everybody can understand where they came from and why we are so resilient, and why when we are faced with certain things, we tend to always rise. You notice that no matter what. You have the towns like Tulsa, Rosewood. We were very, what's the word I'm looking for, Joe?
Independent.
Independent, successful. Yes.
Mhm.
But because of the prejudices and those particular systems in place, they would come and destroy those things. But again, lessons can be learned from the fact that we were able to do that, and we continue to do it.
We rise above it.
Yes, we rise above it every single time. Now, as I said, enslavement ended in Connecticut in 1848. But in reality, slavery did not end in this country in 1863, the way we think that it was supposed to have ended. It actually ended in 1992 in the state of Mississippi. And I used to visit enslaved people on plantations in the 70s as a child. And we would get up early in the morning before the sun, and we would take this ridiculously long drive. You know, when you're a kid, it's, are we there yet? Are we there yet? So we would take this ridiculously long drive, and we finally get there, and we'd spend a couple of hours with these people. But we had to be gone before the sun went down, for fear that we would get trapped on the plantation. Now, when I was little, I always asked my mom, why did we have to always go there? Why couldn't they come to us? And she told me to ask her when I was 13. She thought I was going to forget. 13 rolled around, and I asked her, why were we always going there? She said, ask me when you're 18. Okay. She thought I was going to forget again. On my 18th birthday, the first thing I said to her, okay, I'm 18. Now you got to tell me I'm old enough. And she told me that they were still enslaved, and that's why we had to go visit them, because they were not allowed to go off the plantation. But something even more shocking, in 1992, it was not removed off of the legislative books, meaning it was not made unlawful until February 19, 2013. You can look that up. So enslavement did not end legally in this country, basically until 2013. So let that sink in and think about the different systems that are still in play. Joe, you have anything else you would like to say before we move on to some of these questions?
Yeah, Mississippi. That's Mississippi. Columbus.
Yes.
Yeah, it gave us some things. Mostly, well, you're good. Good things come from Mississippi because that's where you're from.
Yes, I do.
Um,
Good things to come.
So there's that. Now, Mississippi, as you historians in the group and young minds, you may recall that probably in your lifetime that that Confederate emblem was just removed from the Mississippi state flag. So that kind of helps you connect dots as to why it's still necessary for us to do what we do. We hear often as we do what we do, why don't you just forget about it? It was so long ago. But then we are confronted about people wanting to, reinstall Confederate monuments that were already, we had won the battle to take them down and make them go away.
Yeah.
Now they're bringing them back, but they tell us that we need to forget about slavery because it happened so long ago. I'm in South Carolina right now. Back in 2020, we were successful in removing the statue of John C. Calhoun from Marion Square. Now there's this effort to put him back. So that's why Juneteenth is necessary. We were successful in removing the names of Confederates from military installations. Now they're back. So that's why it's necessary for us to continue to do Juneteenth. But I'll put a period there, and we'll entertain some questions.
Yes. What's our time, Fred? Where are we?
It's 10:30.
10:30. Perfect timing. All right. I have a few questions here that was submitted to us from the schools. But before we do the schools, does anyone here in the audience in person have a question or comment that they would like to make before we move to the students? Yes, ma'am.
When is the Tuesday? What day is it in this month?
June 19th, this month is next Friday. It's every June 19th of the month. The Southerners, we tend to blend things, and that's how it became Juneteenth, but it's actually June 19th. And so it's the 19th of every June that is commemorated, because that's the date that the enslaved in Galveston, Texas received the news that they had gotten their freedom. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Yes.
As I heard right now, who is this person Calhoun and why was his statue removed?
Joe, you want to
John
answer
C.
that?
John C. the Great Nullifier.
John C.
John C.
Calhoun.
John C. Calhoun was twice
John C. Calhoun.
twice vice president of the United States, and so for that he's a quite prominent figure. But he was talking secession 20 years before it actually happened, and because his reason for wanting to secede 20 years prior to that time that we actually secede, because of the tariffs that were being placed on property, and of course that property were enslaved people. He felt that the South should be beneficial of all, keep their taxes for themselves on their property. And for that reason, he wanted to secede from the Union 20 years before it actually happened. So there are a lot of things in the state of South Carolina named for John C. Calhoun. And for those who support that, they're in that bucket of folks that I alluded to earlier that want to praise those people of that period, those enslavers of that period, yet they want us to forget about that portion of their lives and want to paint them as good people. I'm not in that camp, so there.
So he was vice president twice, which means he was a very powerful man, but he was also an enslaver and he was also a proponent and a supporter of enslavement. Now, one of the things when talking about the statues, before we get to the questions that we need to keep in mind, the statues were put up 25 years after the Civil War. They were put up as a being a subliminal oppressive tool to keep, during the Jim Crow era, to keep Black and brown people in their place. So when people say, well, it's my heritage that those statues are up, a lot of times they don't know their history and they're quick to claim it. But when they look into their history, they realize, but the people that they have these statues of, Robert E. Lee didn't even want the statue up. He was like, don't put a statue of me up. But they put it up anyway. So we take that in mind. 25 years after the Civil War ended is when those statues went up. So that really isn't a heritage that's tied to the Civil War. That's a lie that is connected to it to make people believe that it's a part of their heritage. All right, so as we're getting ready to move into the questions, I have to do a couple of acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge Hartford Performs for making it possible to have all of the Hartford School join us this year. This is their first time, so thank y'all so very much for that. Burns Latin Studies Academy in Hartford, Mr. Silva's 5th grade class. Thank y'all so very much for your participation. But all of you in social media land as well as Zoom land, thank y'all so very much for supporting the program. Because again, you're being here in person, being in social media or virtual world, you are supporting the programs and you're helping us to keep the history going. So thank you so very much.
Just wanted to interject that Mr. Silver's class just turned on their camera to wave. They're all very excited. Hey guys.
Hello. Thank you so much. All right, so do we have any other questions in person? Yes, ma'am.
Why they choose specifically June for the enslavement month? Is it because it was everywhere? It ends because like you said in Connecticut, it ended in 1848, and Mississippi was 1992. But why
specifically June?
Yeah.
The question is, why specifically the month of June is it chosen to celebrate? 1848 is when slave trading ended in Connecticut. Juneteenth is chosen because that's when the last enslaved people on record, if you will. Mississippi is a whole nother animal, y'all. It's a whole nother world. A lot of things is happening and going on in Mississippi that the outside world doesn't know about. So Juneteenth commemoration is chosen because June 19th technically was the last day that the enslaved people found out that the freedom of that slavery had ended in 1863. So that's why we celebrate June 19th, but it was 1865 that the people in Galveston found out. So it was 2 years after the fact that they found out. And so that's why we celebrate Juneteenth. Now, at the time it was happening in Galveston back in 1865, again, the communication is not like it is today. They didn't have telephones and emails and all of that stuff where it could send out a mass email, hey, everybody's free. It wasn't like that. And so communication was not the way it is today, where you can connect with people across the world instantly. So that was one of the reasons why. But Juneteenth is the day that was chosen because they were, at that time, thought to be the last group of enslaved people to find out about their freedom. Great question. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. You answered that so beautifully. And we also have to think about logistics,
Yes.
moving of troops. Because, although the emancipation, if you look at the emancipation when it was first issued, if there were not any federal troops in those areas, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really mean anything. Those federal troops had to be there to reinforce it. And the logistics dictated that they only got there to, as Tammy said, June 19th of 1865. So that's why we have been commemorating it on this date. I'm glad it wasn't the 20th. I don't know what acronym or what pretty word we could.
I know, what could we move to June 20th, right?
Yeah.
During the teens of the week, it would have worked, but if they had to hit the 20th, yeah, we'd have a different name for it. All right, any other questions or comments before we get to the student questions? Well, thank you in person for your questions. We really appreciate it. Now we have a question, Joe. It says, what would have happened if the North did not win the Civil War? Joe?
Well, I think eventually the slavery would have ended. I cannot put a date on that. It was certainly withering because the North had already proven that if you want to produce a middle class, you cannot compete with enslaving people, because you as a person, a part of the middle class, you're going to always be underbid by enslaved people because they got paid nothing, just their owners did. But that was reversed in the South. The South was that, that 2% or so wanted to keep all that wealth for themselves and not spread it to the enslaved. I think I got a good example. Wilmington, North Carolina, there's a Bellamy plantation built in 1859, probably the most magnificent place in Wilmington, North Carolina, and a radius for miles. That's the most significant place ever. Well, that house was built in 1859. That house was built by the owner on credit. So that means that owner expected that institution to last forever. It was chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is not only are you enslaved, but your children and your children's children would be enslaved. So had it not been for that Civil War, that war would have progressed. Now, how much beyond 1865? It's a little harder to put an estimate, or give a particular year, but just know that had the North not won, the institution, that peculiar institution, would have gone on longer.
Thank you. Now, what did the enslaved in the North mostly do if there were not that many farms in Connecticut? A lot of times they took our households. There was farming. There was various farms here in Connecticut, and then that's when the factories and the clothing plants would come into play. Cotton would be sent here. You have right up the street from us in Norwich, there was a factory there that cotton was used to help produce the textiles or the clothing or the material to make clothing. So although agriculture was not as big in the North as it is in the South, agriculture did happen here, but it was more about textiles, tobacco, as well as, believe it or not, red onions. So that was the things that they would have here. Our next question, Joe, did you have anything you want to add before I move to the next one?
Yeah. So they would have been living a life similar to Adam. Adam lived right above where you guys are, up in the garret. Slavery in those northern states tend to be more intimate in the sense that they were they live closer to each other. A lot of times when we are honoring the spaces of where the enslaved people were, those spaces are a lot of times saved by default, because that's a magnificent historical house you guys are in right now. And in saving that place of importance, that place matters. So does the place up above. So I guess I said that to say this. It's all of what Tammy said slavery was. Now, also keep in mind that there were plantations. They were just not seasonably beneficial of, that southern climate where plantations could be more beneficial financially. So there.
Also, let's keep in mind that when you visit some of these museums with the big houses on them, they're plantations. They just don't want to call them plantations here in Connecticut, but they were plantations. So we need to keep that in mind. Also, when you hear about weddings and things happening on plantations, which is a whole nother discussion, we'll have another time, but that is something to keep in mind, that this beautiful home, this beautiful museum, it was once a plantation, but in the North, they like to remove the plantation. In the South, they still celebrate that word, but just know that a plantation is a plantation is a plantation. Let's see. Now, the next question is, did all of the enslaved go free as soon as the Civil War ended? We kind of touched on that a little bit. They should have been, but not necessarily all of them. If we take the sin that we're celebrating the 250th of the installment of this country, let's take it back to the Revolutionary War, the War of Freedom from Britain. There was a law that was put in place that if you had enslaved individuals, men, and if you as the enslaver did not want to go, or have your son go, your enslaved person could go in their place, with the stipulation that if they made it back home alive, that they were to be free. It did not always happen that way. A lot of these men returned home and thought they were free, but the enslavers would put them back into enslavement because they did not want to lose that income. So to answer that question, it's possible. On paper, they definitely should have been. Did they all? Most likely not, because again, enslavement did not end in Mississippi until 1992. So not at all was that the case. Any other questions or comments about what we've talked about thus far? Yes, ma'am.
Do we still have enslavement at this moment anywhere?
Yes, enslavement definitely is still around. Enslavement has been around since the beginning of time. However, there were laws established biblically that the enslaved person were to be treated just as good as a family member. They were not supposed to be treated like chattel or like animals, if you will. There were laws to how enslaved people were to be treated. However, once enslavement came to the North America continent, that is when the chattel enslavement actually took place. And I think on this continent is where chattel slavery happened the most in regards to the treatment of how people were actually treated. Joe, you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, but let me go back just a little. Slavery, 1865 ends, but we got to think about those things that replaced it. We got to think about the 13th Amendment. We got to think about forced labor, convict labor, redlining, poll taxes, all of that.
So it's slavery by another form, but it is definitely still in effect. The 13th Amendment, that loophole made it possible for the school to prison pipeline to happen. That's a form of enslavement because they take people, put them in prison at young ages, and they are there for a very long time. And that's free labor. That's free labor that they're getting under the law because these people can't do anything about it because they broke the law. So slavery definitely still exists. It does. All right, we have a question online.
Yep, we have a question from the chat that kind of is a nice follow-up here. A student asked, you mentioned that there were slave Bibles made. Did these have modified versions of books like Genesis with new pro-slavery text, or were parts simply removed?
Great question. The slave Bible, or the Black Bible as it's called in the South, they would just remove certain texts out of the Bible to support their theory. For instance, in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, I think Leviticus 3, 5, and 6, don't quote me for specifics, but it's in those two books. It talks about those who didn't serve God as being heathens. Now, that's an old Greek word, the Greek word for that. But however, the premise of enslavement was to keep people out of what we want to call the ghetto. Meaning, when you fell on hard times for 7 years, you would go and work for someone who had the means. They would pay you. But for the first 6 years, you worked for them. They took care of your needs. They took care of your clothes. They took care of your debts. That 7th year was your year to work, save your money, and to get out of that situation. That is really what enslavement was about. It was not about chattel slavery. It was not about perpetuity where you and then the next generation. It was not about that. It was man's greed that flipped all of that around. Great question. Joe, you want to add anything?
Yes, yeah, we took it to another level here because slavery was going on in Africa, but it was going in all the ways that Tammy described that it was. It was a 7-year thing, usually conquered. You were either conquered or annihilated. Now, if you're a conquered and you get your 7 years, you do your 7 years, but in those 7 years, any child born to an enslaved woman would be from that point forward free. That was not chattel. Your 7 years is done. You could even become a part of that group of people. And then the slavery that existed here, again, was another level, chattel.
Exactly. Are there any other questions?
We do have, sorry. So this may be something that requires follow-up, but somebody asked if there are any resources that folks might recommend for people who are interested in researching their lineage throughout the diaspora back to their port of origin, or perhaps even just following family lineage throughout the country.
Actually, we can tell you right now. One of the things you can do is visit. If you know where your lineage actually started, you can start there. There's a free website called Family Search, which is a part of Ancestry.com, where you can put names in and it can take you in different directions to lead you. However, when you're doing your genealogy research, you got to realize a couple of things. Names will change, spellings of the names will change, and sometimes that same name you could have the same James like 15 times. So you have to figure out which James you're really talking about to make sure you're in that line. So those are just some of the things to get you started. Start with where you actually started from. If you know the origin of where your ancestors started, do the family search if you can't afford the membership for Ancestry.com. And you can also do the DNA test with African ancestry. I did that on my maternal side. We are from Cameroon and the Bioko Island. So there's a great distance of space there, but that's another story. So those are some of the things where you can start to get started. Great question.
And I've gotten the chat to announce that VCMS has to leave and sign off. So
we just have one more question and we are done. But thank you so very much for joining us. We really, truly appreciate you supporting us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, we just have one more question and then we will move on to the next thing. Did people in the North who did not believe in slavery put pressure on enslavers in the North to free their enslaved? Simple answer is yes. Here at the Hempsted Houses, you have a couple of the sisters who would be abolitionists. I guess you would say they were abolitionists, and they would protest. And even at that time, in the 1800s, as women, because at that time women didn't have many rights, but they would protest and they would stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. So yes, you had plenty of people. Frederick Douglass came to Connecticut to protest. He was another famous pamphleteer who would write and be an orator to speak out against enslavement. You had Belinda the African. She was a woman who could not read or write, but she had Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Hall write her words in objection to her enslavement and not being paid. Her letters, her writing, you can find it on Tufts University website, and her writings is what is used today for the basis of reparations for descendants of the enslaved people. So 200 and some years later, her words are still helping us fight for those reparations. So yes, there were those here in the North who definitely put pressure on enslavers to end enslavement. Are there any other questions or comments? Joe, you want to say one last thing before we go?
Yeah, well, I think one example of putting pressure was one of your characters, Mom Bet.
Yes, Elizabeth Reed.
Although she wasn't making that direct appeal, taking her case to court and winning, I mean, was a form of resistance. And I heard you use the term earlier that escaped me, but you said, people were kind of representatives or spokespeople. And a lot of what was being produced against all the anti-slavery literature was forbidden in these parts.
Yes.
If that stuff got down south, it would be, you could be put on trial for encouraging insurrections and things of this nature. But now another thing we need to keep in mind is that we kind of historically, we learned that historically, Quakers were abolitionists on the abolitionist side in that basket. Well, before they became abolitionists, they enslaved people. So, we've got to keep all that in mind when we think about this thing called slavery. So guys, thank you for the opportunity to hang out with you today. I'm going to be seeing you physically. I hope that everybody can come to the event on Saturday and Sunday, both, and be a part of what we're offering then.
Thank you, Joe, for being with us today. We have, just before we go, thank you very much. Before we go, this Friday at 5:30 here at the Hempsted Houses, we will have the community conversation. And that is something where we get together as a community and we talk about events that is happening that impacts all of us in the community. So please come out. It's from 5:30 to 7 and let your voices be heard. And on Saturday from 11 to 4, we have the actual Juneteenth commemoration. There, Joe, you will see Joe and I will do a performance of Joan Jackson. Joan Jackson, an untold love story. Her son was Adam Jackson, who was enslaved on this property and lived up in the garret in the house up on the hill right here on this property. But Joan's story is it's not so much about enslavement as it is about Black love. And to come and hear her story, you will hear how one man fought to get his family back and the perils that he endured. Just to give you a little teaser, he found out once she was kidnapped and put back into enslavement, he found out where his wife was, sailed the Long Island, rocky Long Island Sound. But the part that I love is how he goes into the house, takes a nap, then takes his family to freedom. So you have to come hear this story. There will be jazz music, there will be food trucks, and will we have drumming this year?
Yes.
And we will have drumming. So please come out and support us either Friday evening, Saturday from 11 to 4, and then Sunday they have what is church service, and they have a great buffet of food. So please join us this weekend as we commemorate Juneteenth to honor those who were before us. So thank you all, everyone, for joining us in social media land, out in the schools. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, for those who are on, this will conclude our virtual event today. We will be sending out a link to the recording. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Hempsted Houses. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.